Top 10 teams that will plummet. Appreciate you being here at the Voice of College Football, breaking down the game we all love each and every day with you. Best discussion, debate, and analysis. Please like and subscribe. The AP poll was released on Monday, and we can actually gain more from what we can expect to be inaccurate about the AP poll and the coaches poll, because it's basically the same poll. It's groupthink. Everybody gets together and they have the same evaluation of all these teams heading into each season. So it's groupthink. So both polls are basically telling us the same thing. These are the best teams, the elite teams, and on down the line through the top 25. What the AP poll has shown us through the years is that the number one preseason team only has about a 15% chance of winning the national championship. Sorry, Georgia, everybody has you as the odds-on favorite, but you've got about a 15% chance based on history. Let's look at the top 10 from the AP. Number 1, Georgia. 2, Ohio State. 3, Oregon. Texas. 4, Bama. 5, Ole Miss at number 6. Notre Dame. 7, Penn State. 8, Michigan. 9. Those are the only two teams that were flip-flopped in the coaches poll, with Michigan at 8, Penn State at 9, Florida State at number 10. Our project here is to identify those teams that are going to plummet. So this is what history has shown us, that in 20 of the last 21 seasons, one of these teams will finish not just outside the top 10, but will finish outside of the poll, outside of the top 25. Consider that. Pick your team right now. Who in the AP top 10 is not going to finish ranked? Let's look at the last 3 seasons. In 2023, there's your top 10, with Georgia 1, Michigan, Ohio State, Bama, LSU at 5, USC, Penn State, Florida State, Clemson, Washington. The one team that did not finish ranked, USC from number 6, finished 7-5 in the regular season, 8-5 overall, did not finish ranked. Out of these 10 teams, of course, that would make 9 that finished in the rankings. 6 finished in the top 10. LSU, USC, Penn State, and Clemson finished outside the top 10. Here in 2022 is your top 10 to start the season. Bama 1, Ohio State 2, Georgia 3, Clemson, Notre Dame, Texas A&M, Utah at 7, Michigan, Oklahoma, and Baylor. 7 of those teams finished ranked. Texas A&M, OU, and Baylor did not. Only 5 of the 10 finished in the top 10, with Clemson at 13 and Notre Dame at 18 outside the top 10. In 2021, it looked like this. Bama was preseason number 1, followed by Oklahoma, Clemson, Ohio State at 4, Georgia 5, Texas A&M, Iowa State, Cincinnati, Notre Dame, and North Carolina, with some rare teams selected there in the final spots of the top 10 in 2021. Well, who finished in the top 10? 6 of the 10 and 7 finished ranked, with Clemson at number 14 outside the top 10, but finishing in the top 25. Texas A&M, Iowa State, and North Carolina did not finish ranked, although they did all have winning records and finished close to the top 25. That brings us to this season. Let's go through the top 10 teams in America according to the AP and the worst case scenario. So we're trying to find the likeliest team to finish outside the top 10, outside of the rankings, to close 2024. Let's start with number 1, Georgia. They are the consensus number 1 by far in both polls. Their most difficult games: at Bama, at Texas, at Ole Miss. 3 difficult games, possibly the 3 best teams other than themselves in the SEC. Now let's look at the entirety of the Georgia schedule. What games could Georgia possibly lose? I mean possibly lose. Well, they play Clemson in week 1. Yeah, they're a 2-touchdown favorite, but of course Clemson's a capable football team. They played a 10-3 game a few seasons ago. Certainly Clemson could beat Georgia. Georgia could lose at Kentucky. That is a possibility. Again, we are talking about worst case scenarios. Of course, they could lose in Tuscaloosa against the Tide. The Auburn game on the Plains last year was a tie ball game with 4 or 5 minutes left. Auburn's supposed to be improved this year. Georgia could lose to Auburn in one of the biggest rivalries in college football. Got to give them a pass against Mississippi State. Of course, they could lose at Texas. They will probably be a pick'em type game. Maybe they'll be a slight favorite. Actually, Florida's got a chance of defeating Georgia. Again, we are talking worst case scenario. Georgia goes to Ole Miss. They won that game by 5 touchdowns at home, but Ole Miss is supposed to be much improved, number 6 team in the country to start the season. Georgia, Tennessee, that's a losable ball game as well. UMass, Georgia Tech, can't imagine losing to either one of those teams, although the Yellow Jackets gave Georgia quite a game at the Georgia Dome last season. So, talking worst case scenario, lose to Clemson, lose to Bama, lose to Texas. That's 3 losses. Let's say between Kentucky on the road and Auburn, they lose another game there. That's 4. Again, worst case scenario, Ole Miss makes it 5. And then let's say between Florida, Tennessee, and Georgia Tech, they lose one more game. Worst case scenario for Georgia, 6-6. Ohio State was supposed to play Washington in non-conference play, but of course that game was canceled because we found out just a few months later that the Huskies would be part of the Big Ten. So Ohio State's got a cakewalk non-conference, but still, once they enter the Big Ten, there are some landmines for the number 2 team in the nation. First 3 games of the season, forget it. If Ohio State's going to lose one of those games, shut down Columbus, Ohio. At Michigan State should be a win, of course. Could they lose that game? Of course they could lose that game. We can go through the history of college football and find bigger upsets. But the first feasible loss is at home against Iowa. And Ohio State could lose against Oregon. That's 2 losses. Now, between Nebraska, Penn State, those games, of course they can lose in Happy Valley. They almost do every time they play there. So that's 3 losses. And, hey, Nebraska is supposed to be much improved. And again, worst case scenario, between Iowa, Oregon, Nebraska, and Penn State, I'm saying 4 losses right there. And then, of course, they can't beat Michigan because they never do. They would lose to Michigan once again. So it would be worst case scenario for the Buckeyes, 7-5. Outside of Georgia and Ohio State, Oregon seems to be the darlings of the preseason prognostications. Those first 3 games will be wins. Worst case scenario, could they possibly lose against Boise State or Oregon State on the road? Worst case scenario, sure. Not both of them, but one of them, reasonably. Yes, there's one. UCLA and Michigan State appear to be pushovers. Let's go to the Ohio State game. That's a 2nd loss. And then Michigan on the road. That would be loss number 3. At Wisconsin, that would be loss number 4. For Oregon. So again, this is reasonable. Worst case scenario, you would consider Washington typically to be a threat, but the game's at home, and we will go worst case scenario for the Oregon Ducks, 8 wins, 4 losses. Now let's go to Texas. Just about everyone has them as a consensus college football playoff team with a minimum record of 10-2, but we were looking at worst case scenario, and Texas could certainly go to Ann Arbor and lose. There's a loss right there. Texas San Antonio, even though they're a fine group of 5 team, that's a bit out of our reach. Let's go to the next down spot possibility, and of course, Oklahoma beat Texas last year. They own the series. They own Texas, and even though the Longhorns are supposed to be better, much of that has to do with an easier schedule, not necessarily that Texas is that much better than Oklahoma. Sure, the Sooners could win that game. They probably have like a 40 to 45% chance of doing so as it stands right now. So that's a 2nd loss for Texas. Georgia would be number 3. Florida could beat Texas. That would be loss number 4. And then let's say between traveling to Arkansas, Kentucky, and Texas A&M, worst case scenario, they lose to either Arkansas or Kentucky, and they also lose to Texas A&M, and Texas finishes this season at 6-6. Bama fans, before you pounce, let's consider Nick Saban, the GOAT, is gone. And let's also consider that I just did my live show and went on and on about how is Bama discounted and discarded for a possible run at the national championship. I still believe in this team. I believe in this program, and I believe in Kalen DeBoer. But again, we're talking worst case scenario. And for Bama, there are a lot of worst case scenarios out there because they've got a tough schedule. They go to Camp Randall Stadium, and yes, the Tide is a much better team, but Wisconsin's a capable team. There's a loss. Georgia's a loss. That's number 2. okay, we can't conceivably think that Vandy or South Carolina is a threat. Let's go to the Tennessee game. Of course, that would be loss number 3. Mizzou would be 4. LSU would be 5. And then look at the final 2 games of the season. At Oklahoma, that's a toss-up. So that's loss number 6. And then look at what Auburn's done against Alabama in recent years. I know the game's played in Tuscaloosa, and Auburn has its magic going at Jordan-Hare Stadium. So this has been typically a 4-touchdown win for Bama. But again, new team, new coach, the whole new deal in Auburn could be much improved, should be much improved. Bama would be tagged with an incredible 7 losses. Ole Miss is the chic pick in 2024 to possibly contend for a national championship and certainly make the playoff. They have not won a national championship since the early 60s and Johnny Vaught. How could they be derailed here? Well, in the first 4 games, there is no resistance. So the Rebels show up at 4-0 against Kentucky. Well, the Wildcats took them down to the final play of the game just a couple of years ago at Vaught-Hemingway Stadium. So that would be the first upset loss for Ole Miss. They lose to Kentucky. Let's not have them losing in South Carolina as a worst-case scenario. Let's go to Death Valley for loss number 2. Then, of course, they've got Oklahoma. That's loss number 3. Georgia, 4. And let's say between Arkansas, Florida, and Mississippi State, they lose one more game. We've got Ole Miss, worst-case scenario, 7-5. Notre Dame begins its 2024 season with a huge non-conference game against Texas A&M on the road. Of course, that could be a loss right there. Notre Dame, in fact, right now is a slight underdog. Then you got to think the next 3 games are gimmies, although this is a program that lost to Marshall and also lost to Stanford 2 seasons ago. So nothing is out of the realm of possibility, especially a trip to Purdue. But we'll say Notre Dame wins those 3. They just lost to Louisville last year. Sure, they've got them at home, but again, we're talking worst case scenario. 2 losses there. Give them a win against Stanford and even Georgia Tech. Although, again, Georgia Tech could be a threat. We'll stay with the 2 losses as of now. But Florida State's a loss, and also USC would be a loss in a worst case scenario. That makes 4. Now let's group all these other games together. The group of 5 games in the MAC, Stanford, Georgia Tech, Navy, and also this Virginia game with the Cavaliers stunning North Carolina last year, and they almost pulled off some other upsets. So between all those other games, sure, Notre Dame could lose another game. That would land Notre Dame at 7-5. Penn State is supposed to be the epitome of a 10-2 team and many times has been under James Franklin. But what about the worst case scenario in 2024? Go to West Virginia and lose. Don't even have to argue that one. 3 new coordinators for Penn State. They did not dominate West Virginia at home in Happy Valley last year. West Virginia played a heck of a game. It was a 1-2 score game into the 4th quarter. It was 31-15 with like 15 seconds left in the game. West Virginia's got a ton of returning production. This could be an upset. So that is not in any way a stretch to say Penn State gets upset against West Virginia. The next 2 weeks, of course, they win those games against the MAC. Illinois, remember, 9 overtimes against a Penn State team that was coming off a 10-2 season a few years ago? Okay, let's put that one in the back pocket. Let's look at the most reasonable losses. Of course, a trip to the LA Coliseum would be 1. Wisconsin would be 2. That one's on the road. And Ohio State would be a 3rd consecutive loss for Penn State. That's 4 losses. The 3 we just mentioned plus West Virginia. That's 4 losses. The rest of the slate, Penn State is considerably better than all those teams, but the law of averages, people, if Penn State is, let's say, an 80 to 90% pick against all these teams, Illinois, UCLA, Washington even, Purdue, Minnesota, Maryland, add all that together with the probabilities, you understand that if you are a favorite at a 90% level against 2 teams, you put those together and your probability of defeating both of them drops to about 81%, 90 times 90. If you do that through this stretch of games, you're doing that about 5 times. So the likelihood that Penn State's going to win all those games is somewhere more in the 55 to 60% range. So tack on another loss against somebody. whether that's Illinois, whether that's a trip to Minnesota, whether that's Maryland, a team that, of course, is pretty capable. Yes, it's conceivable that Penn State could lose more than one game. We'll give them, though, in this exercise, one loss. So Penn State finishes at 6-6. Now let's kick it to the three-time defending Big Ten champions, the national champions, and, of course, always the champions of the West, Michigan. Lose to Texas, lose to USC. Win the rest of these games we're looking at in October, even conceding those games. Let's say they lose to Oregon. That's 3 losses. They lose at Ohio State. And then, similar to the Penn State exercise, put together the likes of Washington, Minnesota, Illinois, Michigan State, and others. Northwestern, which, of course, was a good team last year. And let's say Michigan drops one of those many games in which they will be a 15 or 20 or 25-point favorite. That means Michigan's worst-case scenario becomes 7-5. And that brings us to our final top 10 team, according to the AP, and that's Florida State. Now let's look at likely losses. There aren't many. Clemson, the 6th game of the season. That's at Doak Campbell Stadium at the beginning of October. The next one at Miami, who could be the favorite to win the ACC. It's pretty much between Florida State, Clemson, and Miami, according to Vegas. Of course, the other loss would be at Notre Dame. So there's 3. 3 that are not probable, but certainly toss-up type of games. All right, now let's start to group them together. Considering Florida State went 13-0 before their postseason loss last year, and they almost lost to Boston College, they almost lost to Duke, and they almost lost to Pitt. They were challenged in all of those games. So it is not inconceivable that between Georgia Tech, Boston College, Memphis, Cal, and SMU, that they don't drop one of those games. That would be a 4th loss. And then if we go through the rest of the schedule, the likes of Duke on the road, North Carolina, and Florida, the Gators, capable. Of course, a bad Florida team took Florida State to the 4th quarter last year, and even with Jordan Travis on the field in previous years, challenged Florida State. So worst case scenario for Florida State, reasonable worst case scenario is 7-5. So if we're trying to pick out the team out of the top 10 that is most likely to finish unranked based on schedule, I'd say Bama. It's a difficult schedule. Based on the team being possibly susceptible to letdown, to questionable coaching, based on its history, I look to Notre Dame and I look to Penn State being the most likely to drop all the way unranked, which looks like an 8-4 regular season and a bowl loss is the most likely scenario for a team to fall, as it has 20 of the last 21 seasons, completely out of the top 10, out of the rankings for the final rankings according to the AP in 2024. Leave your comments and suggestions and questions down below right here at the Voice of College Football. And again, it does not appear likely, but you know what? The probability is that it's going to happen, and probably more than once here in 2024. A top 10 is out of the rankings at season's end. We appreciate you being here. Lock it in right here at the Voice of College Football.